Some secrets are so heavy that they become the foundation upon which entire lives are built. Eleanor Vance understood this better than anyone. For 30 years, she lived alone in a 15-room Victorian mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by memories she couldn't share and truths she refused to speak. The elegant widow with perfectly coiffed silver hair became a ghost in her own social circle, declining every invitation, avoiding every gathering, living in voluntary exile from the world that once celebrated her. But silence, no matter how carefully maintained, is never truly permanent. On a cold November morning in 2015, an unmarked manila envelope arrived at Eleanor's door. Inside were 4 photographs, yellowed with age, showing documents she thought she had burned 4 decades ago. No letter, no demands, just those images and the unmistakable message they carried. Someone knew. What had Eleanor Vance discovered about her late husband, the billionaire real estate mogul Harrison Vance, that was worth 3 decades of self-imposed isolation? Why would a woman who had everything choose to live with nothing but her guilt? And who was finally ready to shatter the carefully constructed silence she had built around the darkest chapter of her life? This is the story of Eleanor Vance and the inheritance of silence that nearly destroyed her. Eleanor Vance's daily routine had not changed in 30 years. Every morning at 6, she would walk through the marble hallways of the Vance Estate, a historic mansion built in 1898 that sat on 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in the heart of Greenwich's Belle Haven neighborhood. The house staff had been reduced to just 3 people: Marcus, the groundskeeper who had worked for the family since 1980, and a rotating pair of housekeepers who came twice a week and knew better than to make conversation. The mansion itself was a monument to a different era. 19 rooms filled with museum-quality antiques, original impressionist paintings on the walls, and a grand ballroom that hadn't seen guests since 1985. The neighbors in Belle Haven, where hedge fund managers and old money lived side by side in multi-million-dollar estates, had long ago stopped trying to include Eleanor in their social functions. She was the enigma of Greenwich, the reclusive widow who had once been the crown jewel of Connecticut society. Those who remembered Eleanor from the 1970s and early 1980s recalled a completely different woman. Back then, she and Harrison Vance were the golden couple of the Northeast elite. Harrison, with his sharp mind and ruthless business instincts, had built an empire buying and developing properties from Boston to Miami. Eleanor, a former Miss Connecticut runner-up with a degree from Vassar, was his perfect complement, hosting legendary charity galas, sitting on the boards of 3 museums, and raising their 2 children, Victoria and James, in the kind of privileged bubble that only Greenwich could provide. The society pages of the Hartford Courant and New York Times were filled with photographs of the Vances. Eleanor in Valentino gowns at the Met Gala. Harrison shaking hands with governors and senators. Their annual Christmas party was the most coveted invitation in Fairfield County. Their marriage appeared flawless, their success inevitable, their future limitless. Then, in March of 1985, Harrison Vance died of a sudden heart attack at age 52. He collapsed in his office at Vance Properties headquarters in Stamford, surrounded by legal documents and accountants. The funeral drew over 800 mourners. Eleanor, devastated and elegant in black Chanel, stood beside her 24-year-old daughter and 22-year-old son, accepting condolences with grace and composure. What no one knew was that Eleanor had stopped speaking to Harrison 3 months before his death. What no one understood was that the widow crying at the funeral was not mourning the man everyone thought they knew, but grieving for the lie her entire life had become. After the funeral, Eleanor withdrew, first gradually, then completely. She stopped attending charity events. She resigned from museum boards. She declined invitations from friends who had known her for decades. By 1990, she had become virtually invisible, a phantom living in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum. Her children, Victoria and James, tried for years to understand. But Eleanor kept them at arm's length, offering vague explanations about grief and needing time. Eventually, they stopped trying. Victoria moved to San Francisco, married a tech entrepreneur, and built a life 3,000 miles away from her mother's incomprehensible isolation. James stayed closer, settling in Manhattan, but the relationship remained cordial and distant, marked by obligatory phone calls on birthdays and holidays. The staff who worked at the estate learned quickly that certain topics were forbidden. No one mentioned Harrison. No one asked about the locked study on the second floor that Eleanor entered only once a year, on the anniversary of his death. No one questioned why a woman with a fortune estimated at over $200 million chose to live like a prisoner in her own home. On that November morning in 2015, Eleanor was having tea in the conservatory when Marcus brought her the mail. Among the usual bills and charity solicitations was the unmarked manila envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it, something Marcus noticed but wisely chose to ignore. Inside were 4 photographs, clearly copies of originals, printed on standard paper. They showed documents, contracts, bank statements, and handwritten notes. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She recognized Harrison's handwriting immediately. These were papers from the locked drawer in his desk, documents she had found in December of 1984, documents she had photographed before confronting him, and documents she thought she had destroyed after his death. But here they were. Someone had them. Someone knew. For 30 years, Eleanor had lived with the weight of what she had discovered. For 30 years, she had chosen silence over truth, believing it was the only way to protect what remained of her family. Now, someone was threatening to tear it all open. Eleanor sat in the conservatory for 3 hours, staring at those photographs, her tea growing cold beside her. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her secret were cracking, and she had no idea who was on the other side, waiting to break through. To understand what Eleanor discovered, we must go back to December 1984, to a time when she still believed in the life she was living. It started with a phone call. Eleanor was planning the annual Vance Christmas Gala when a woman named Catherine Delgado called the house, insisting she needed to speak with Harrison urgently. When Eleanor explained that her husband was at the office, Catherine's voice broke. She said she had lost everything because of Harrison Vance, that her family was being evicted from their home, and that she needed to know why he had done this to them. Eleanor, confused and concerned, pressed for details. Catherine explained that 2 years earlier, in 1982, Harrison's company had approached her elderly parents about selling their home in Bridgeport. The house had been in the Delgado family for 40 years, fully paid off, sitting on a lot that Harrison wanted for a commercial development. Her parents, both in their 70s and struggling with medical bills, were told by Harrison's representatives that the city had plans to seize their property through eminent domain for a highway expansion. They were told they would lose the house anyway and receive almost nothing in compensation. Harrison's offer of $75,000 seemed like a mercy. Catherine's parents sold. They used the money to pay their debts and moved into a small apartment. But the highway expansion never happened. There had never been any plans for it. 6 months later, Harrison developed the property into a strip mall, which he sold for $2.3 million. The Delgados discovered they had been lied to, manipulated into selling their home for a fraction of its actual value, based on a complete fabrication. Eleanor listened to Catherine's story with growing horror. She wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, a mistake made by overzealous employees. But something in Catherine's voice, the raw pain and betrayal, made her doubt. After hanging up, Eleanor did something she had never done before. She went into Harrison's study at home and began looking through his files. What she found in the locked bottom drawer of his mahogany desk would shatter everything she believed about her husband and her life. There were dozens of files, each representing a different property acquisition between 1978 and 1984, and the pattern was unmistakable. Harrison's company had systematically targeted elderly homeowners, recent immigrants, and financially struggling families throughout Connecticut and neighboring states. The tactics varied, but the goal was always the same: acquire valuable property for pennies on the dollar through deception and manipulation. Some families were told about fake highway projects. Others were warned about environmental contamination that didn't exist. Some were threatened with property tax increases that were never coming. A Vietnamese family in New Haven was told their documentation was insufficient, and they would be deported unless they sold immediately. An elderly black couple in Hartford was intimidated by men in suits who implied their neighborhood was being targeted for gang activity and suggested they leave while they still could. Eleanor found contracts, internal memos, and handwritten notes in Harrison's distinctive script. One note, attached to the file for a property in Waterbury, read, "Widow, husband died 6 months ago, behind on taxes, vulnerable. Offer $40,000. She'll take it. Property worth $180,000 minimum after rezoning." The clinical coldness of it made Eleanor physically ill. This wasn't business. This was predatory, calculated cruelty targeting the most vulnerable people Harrison could find. And he had been doing it for years, building his empire on the broken dreams and stolen futures of families who trusted him. Eleanor photographed the most damning documents with a camera she kept for cataloging art pieces. Her hands shook as she worked, and tears blurred her vision, but she methodically documented everything. She didn't know yet what she would do with the evidence, but some instinct told her she needed proof of what she had discovered. When Harrison came home that night, Eleanor was waiting in his study. The files were spread across his desk. The color drained from his face when he saw what she had found. The argument that followed was unlike anything in their 26-year marriage. Harrison didn't deny it. Instead, he justified it. He said this was how real estate development worked, that every successful developer used similar tactics, that the families would have lost their properties anyway to someone else. He said she had enjoyed the wealth these deals created, the mansion they lived in, the lifestyle she led, and that she had no right to judge him now. Eleanor asked him about the Delgados. She asked about the Vietnamese family. She asked about the elderly widow in Waterbury. Harrison's response was cold. He said they were adults who signed contracts, that if they were too stupid or too trusting to protect themselves, that was their problem, not his. That was the moment Eleanor's marriage truly ended. Not legally, not publicly, but in every way that mattered. She looked at the man she had loved for more than 2 decades and saw a stranger, a predator in an expensive suit who had built his fortune on the suffering of people who had done nothing to deserve it. Eleanor gave Harrison an ultimatum. She demanded he establish a fund to compensate the families he had defrauded. She wanted at least $10 million set aside, and she wanted him to personally oversee making things right. She told him if he refused, She would take the photographs she had made to the authorities and to the media. Harrison laughed. He told her she would never do it, that exposing him would destroy their children's future, would turn Victoria and James into pariahs, would end everything they had built. He said she lacked the courage to burn down her own life. Eleanor moved into a separate bedroom that night. For 3 months, they lived in the same house as enemies. Harrison refused her demands. Eleanor agonized over what to do, paralyzed by the impossible choice between justice and protecting her children from the scandal that exposing Harrison would create. Then, on March 14, 1985, Harrison collapsed in his office. The initial autopsy suggested a massive heart attack, likely brought on by stress. He was 52 years old. Eleanor never got to make her choice. Death made it for her. What do you think about what Eleanor discovered? Was Harrison a product of his time and industry, or was what he did unforgivable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. In the weeks following Harrison's death, Eleanor faced a decision that would define the rest of her life. She had the photographs, the evidence of everything Harrison had done. She could go public, expose the truth, and potentially help the families he had victimized seek restitution. But doing so would also destroy Harrison's reputation, devastate their children, and likely trigger lawsuits that could consume the entire Vance fortune. Eleanor was also aware of a darker reality. If Harrison's tactics were investigated, questions would inevitably arise about how much she had known and when she had known it. The mansion she lived in, the art she had collected, the charitable donations she had made, all of it had been funded by Harrison's fraudulent deals. In the eyes of the law, or at least in the court of public opinion, she might be seen as complicit. Her lawyer, Robert Hutchins, who had served the Vance family for 20 years, advised her in the strongest possible terms to remain silent. He explained that Harrison's company had already passed to new ownership under terms of his will, that the specific employees who had carried out his instructions were no longer with the firm, and that opening investigations into deals from years or even decades past would be enormously complicated and might not even result in meaningful restitution for the victims. Most importantly, Hutchins reminded her of Victoria and James. At 24 and 22, they were just beginning their adult lives. Victoria was engaged to be married. James was interviewing for positions at investment banks in Manhattan. If their father was posthumously revealed as a con artist who had built his fortune defrauding vulnerable families, the scandal would follow them forever. Eleanor made her decision. She would stay silent about what Harrison had done, but she would not do nothing. Using the detailed files she had found, Eleanor began a secret project. She hired a private investigator to locate the families Harrison had defrauded, working under strict confidentiality agreements. Over the next 5 years, Eleanor systematically worked through the list, finding as many victims as she could. Some had died, some had moved away and couldn't be found. But for those she could locate, Eleanor created what she called a private restitution fund. Through an anonymous intermediary, families began receiving unexpected financial settlements. The Delgados received a check for $180,000 with a simple note: compensation for the unjust sale of your family property in 1982. A Vietnamese family in New Haven received enough money to buy a home twice the size of the one they had been pressured to sell. The elderly widow in Waterbury received a settlement that allowed her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Eleanor calculated what each property had actually been worth, what Harrison had paid, and she paid the difference plus 30 years of appreciation. By 1995, Eleanor had quietly distributed over $12 million to 43 families. Most never knew where the money came from. Some suspected, but the anonymous nature of the payments, always delivered through lawyers who refused to reveal their client, kept Eleanor's involvement hidden. But the financial cost was nothing compared to the emotional toll. Eleanor lived with the knowledge that there were families she couldn't find, suffering she couldn't undo, and a truth she had chosen to bury. Every dollar she gave away felt both necessary and insufficient. She was trying to buy redemption for sins that weren't even hers, yet she felt responsible for them anyway. The isolation Eleanor imposed on herself was not just about avoiding difficult questions from friends and society. It was penance. She felt she had no right to the privileges and pleasures of the life Harrison's crimes had built. The charity galas and museum benefits she had once enjoyed now seemed obscene. How could she celebrate at elegant parties while families Harrison had destroyed might still be struggling? Her relationship with Victoria and James deteriorated, not because of any specific conflict, but because Eleanor couldn't explain her transformation without revealing the truth about their father. Victoria, especially, felt abandoned. She wanted her mother at her wedding in 1987, wanted her involved with her grandchildren when they were born in 1990 and 1992, wanted the connection they had once shared. But Eleanor kept her distance, unable to be present without being honest, and unable to be honest without destroying Victoria's memory of Harrison. James was more understanding of Eleanor's grief, or at least less demanding. He visited occasionally, usually brief lunches at the mansion where they discussed safe topics like the weather and the stock market. But even he couldn't penetrate the wall Eleanor had built around herself. By 2000, Eleanor had completed her private restitution project. She had done everything she could to right Harrison's wrongs, or at least as much as could be done anonymously. But instead of feeling relief, she felt empty. The silence she had chosen to protect her family had become a prison. She had no one to share the truth with, no one who understood the weight she carried. Marcus, the groundskeeper, was perhaps the only person who saw glimpses of Eleanor's pain. He noticed how she stood at the windows of the ballroom sometimes, staring out at the gardens, her expression lost and distant. He saw how she avoided the photographs of Harrison that still hung in the formal rooms, her eyes sliding past them as if they hurt to see. He never asked questions, but his quiet loyalty was one of the few comforts Eleanor had. The irony was not lost on Eleanor. She had sacrificed 3 decades of her life to protect her children from the truth about their father. But in doing so, she had lost any real relationship with them. She had tried to do the right thing, or at least the least wrong thing, but there were no good options when the choice was between truth and family. Thank you for staying with this story through these difficult revelations. Eleanor's journey is only going to become more intense from here. The best is yet to come. The photographs that arrived in November 2015 changed everything. Someone knew about Harrison's schemes, someone had evidence, and someone wanted Eleanor to know that her 30 years of silence might be coming to an end. Eleanor's first instinct was to destroy the photographs and pretend they had never arrived. But that impulse lasted only moments. Whoever had sent them clearly had the originals. Destroying the copies would accomplish nothing. Her second instinct was to call Robert Hutchins, her lawyer. But Hutchins had retired in 2008, and his successor at the firm had no knowledge of Eleanor's secret history. Bringing in a new lawyer would mean revealing everything she had spent 3 decades hiding. Instead, Eleanor did something she had not done in years. She took action on her own. She hired a private investigator, a woman named Sarah Chen, who came highly recommended for discretion and thoroughness. Eleanor showed her the photographs and asked a simple question. "Find out who sent these." Sarah Chen was efficient and relentless. Within 2 weeks, she had traced the envelope to a postal facility in New Haven and identified the sender through security footage and purchase records. The woman who had mailed the photographs was named Margaret Chen, age 34, a freelance investigative journalist who had written extensively about corporate fraud and real estate corruption. The name Chen made Eleanor's blood run cold even before Sarah delivered the rest of her report. Margaret Chen was the daughter of David and Lily Chen, the Vietnamese family who had been threatened with deportation unless they sold their property in New Haven in 1983. Margaret had been only 3 years old when her parents lost their home. Sarah provided Eleanor with Margaret's background. After receiving the anonymous settlement in 1990, the Chen family had been able to rebuild their lives. David had opened a small restaurant. Lily had worked as a seamstress. They had saved enough to send Margaret to college, and she had graduated from Columbia University with a degree in journalism. Her specialty was investigating the kind of corporate malfeasance that had destroyed her family. For years, Margaret had been researching Harrison Vance and Vance properties. She had interviewed former employees, obtained company records through Freedom of Information requests, and pieced together a pattern of fraud that aligned almost perfectly with what Eleanor had discovered in 1984. Margaret's research was meticulous and damning. She had enough evidence to write an exposé that would posthumously destroy Harrison's reputation and potentially trigger criminal investigations into his former company and associates. But Margaret was missing one crucial element: the documents from Harrison's personal files, the handwritten notes and internal memos that proved he had personally directed the fraudulent schemes rather than simply allowing overzealous employees to act on his behalf. She knew those documents must have existed, but she couldn't prove it. Then, through a source Margaret refused to name even in her notes, she learned that Eleanor might have photographed documents from Harrison's study before his death. Margaret had obtained copies of those photographs, though Sarah Chen couldn't determine how. The photographs Margaret sent to Eleanor were a message. "I know what you found. I know you stayed silent. And I'm giving you a chance to explain yourself before I publish what I know." Eleanor read Sarah Chen's report 3 times, her hands trembling. The daughter of one of Harrison's victims had become the instrument of Eleanor's reckoning. There was a terrible poetry to it that Eleanor couldn't ignore. Sarah asked Eleanor if she wanted to pursue legal action to prevent Margaret from publishing her findings. Eleanor said no. Instead, she asked Sarah to arrange a meeting. She was going to face Margaret Chen directly. The meeting took place on a gray December afternoon at the Vance Estate. Eleanor insisted it be at her home, on her terms. Margaret arrived precisely on time, driving a modest Honda that looked out of place in the circular driveway where Bentleys and Mercedes had once parked. Eleanor answered the door herself, something she never did. She led Margaret into the conservatory, where tea was already prepared. The 2 women sat across from each other, separated by a low table and 30 years of history. Margaret spoke first. She was direct, controlled, and absolutely certain of her moral position. She told Eleanor she had been researching Harrison Vance for 6 years, that she knew what he had done to her family and dozens of others, and that she intended to publish a comprehensive expose in a major magazine. She said she had given Eleanor advance notice out of professional courtesy, and because she wanted to give her the opportunity to comment on the record. Then Margaret asked the question that hung between them. "You knew what he did. You found evidence in 1984. Why did you stay silent?" Eleanor could have deflected. She could have denied. But sitting across from the daughter of one of Harrison's victims, she found she didn't want to lie anymore. The weight of 30 years of silence suddenly felt unbearable. So Eleanor told her everything. She described finding the files, confronting Harrison, the 3 months of Cold War in their marriage before his death. She explained the impossible choice she had faced after he died, the decision to protect her children versus seeking justice for his victims. She told Margaret about the private restitution fund, the $12 million she had distributed anonymously, including the settlement Margaret's own family had received. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression carefully neutral. When Eleanor finished, there was a long silence. Then Margaret said something Eleanor didn't expect. "My parents used that money to send me to college. I became a journalist because I wanted to understand how people like your husband could destroy lives and face no consequences. Everything I am is because of what he did to my family, and because of the money you sent us." Eleanor felt tears on her face for the first time in years. She said, "I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry." Margaret's response was measured. She said she understood Eleanor's position intellectually, but emotionally, she still felt Eleanor had chosen her own family's comfort over justice for Harrison's victims. She said the anonymous payments, while helpful, didn't change the fact that Harrison had died with his reputation intact, that no one had been held accountable, and that other developers had likely learned from his example that they could commit fraud without consequences. Most cutting of all, Margaret pointed out that Eleanor's silence had allowed several of Harrison's former associates to continue in the real estate industry, some rising to prominent positions. If Harrison had been exposed in 1985, those men might have faced scrutiny that could have prevented future fraud. Eleanor had no defense. Everything Margaret said was true. Eleanor's choice to remain silent had real consequences beyond her own family. She had prioritized protecting Victoria and James over preventing potential future victims. Margaret then presented Eleanor with an offer. She was going to publish her exposé regardless, but she would give Eleanor the opportunity to tell her side of the story. Eleanor could explain her decision, describe the restitution fund, and present herself as someone who struggled with an impossible moral dilemma rather than simply an enabler who looked the other way. Eleanor considered the offer. For 30 years, she had believed that staying silent was the only way to protect her children. But Victoria and James were now 54 and 52. They had their own lives, their own families, their own successes independent of the Vance name. Would the truth destroy them now? Or would it finally free Eleanor from the prison of her silence? Eleanor made her decision. She told Margaret she would cooperate fully. She would give an interview, she would provide access to whatever documentation she still had, and she would accept whatever consequences came from finally telling the truth. Margaret looked surprised, then thoughtful. She asked Eleanor why she was willing to do this now after 3 decades of silence. Eleanor's answer was simple. Because you deserved a mother who fought for your family in 1985. And my children deserve a mother who stops hiding. I can't change what I did, but I can stop letting it define everything I am. Eleanor's decision to cooperate with Margaret Chen's investigation set in motion a chain of events she could not control and could barely prepare for. The first and most difficult step was telling Victoria and James the truth before Margaret's article was published. Eleanor called both of her children and asked them to come to Greenwich. She said it was urgent and important, but she refused to provide details over the phone. Victoria flew in from San Francisco, her concern evident. James drove up from Manhattan, confused by the rare summons. They met in the formal dining room of the Vance Estate, a room that had once hosted governors and celebrities, but had sat empty for 3 decades. Eleanor had prepared a simple lunch, though none of them had any appetite for it. Eleanor told them everything. She watched her children's faces as she described what she had discovered about their father, the families he had defrauded, the choice she had made to stay silent, and the restitution fund she had created. She explained about Margaret Chen and the upcoming exposé. She apologized for hiding the truth for so long, even as she tried to help them understand why she had made that choice. Victoria's reaction was immediate and devastating. She felt betrayed not just by the revelation about Harrison, but by Eleanor's decades of distance and silence. She said she had spent her entire adult life believing her mother simply didn't care about her, when the truth was that Eleanor had been protecting a secret that Victoria had every right to know. Victoria argued that she and James could have handled the truth about their father at 24 and 22, that they weren't children who needed to be shielded. James was quieter, but no less shaken. He asked practical questions about the financial implications, about whether the exposé would trigger lawsuits against the estate, about whether he and Victoria could face legal liability for inheriting wealth built on fraud. Eleanor's lawyer had assured her they were protected by statutes of limitation and the fact that they had no knowledge of Harrison's actions, but James's trust in institutions had been fundamentally damaged by learning his entire childhood had been built on lies. The lunch ended badly. Victoria left in tears, saying she needed time to process everything. James stayed longer, asking more questions, trying to understand not just what Harrison had done, but why Eleanor had chosen to bear this burden alone. Eleanor had no good answer except the truth. She had thought she was protecting them, and she had been wrong. Over the following weeks, as Margaret prepared her article, Eleanor began the painful process of trying to rebuild relationships with her children. She sent long letters to Victoria, explaining in detail what she had been thinking and feeling in 1985, not to justify her choices, but to help Victoria understand them. She met with James multiple times, answering his questions and slowly revealing the full extent of her isolation and pain over the past 30 years. The responses were mixed. Victoria remained angry and hurt, though her messages gradually became less hostile and more questioning. James seemed torn between sympathy for what Eleanor had endured and frustration that she had made decisions that affected all of them without their input. Margaret Chen's article was published in The Atlantic in March 2016, exactly 31 years after Harrison's death. The title was The Vance Empire: How One Developer Built a Fortune on Fraud and His Widow Tried to Make It Right. The article was exhaustive and fair. Margaret detailed Harrison's schemes with the precision of an investigative journalist, using the documents Eleanor provided as well as her own research. She interviewed several of the families Harrison had defrauded, including her own parents, who spoke publicly for the first time about their experience. She explained the legal and practical reasons why Harrison's crimes had never been prosecuted. But Margaret also gave substantial attention to Eleanor's story. She described the impossible position Eleanor had been in, the restitution fund she had created, and the price she had paid in isolation and estrangement from her children. Margaret didn't excuse Eleanor's silence, but she presented it as a complex moral choice rather than simple complicity. The article included a lengthy interview with Eleanor, her first public comments in 30 years. Eleanor spoke candidly about her regret, her belief that she had failed both Harrison's victims and her own children by choosing silence, and her hope that finally telling the truth might allow her to live the remainder of her life with more honesty and connection. The response to the article was intense and divided. Some readers saw Eleanor as a victim herself, a woman who had discovered terrible truths and made the best decisions she could under impossible circumstances. Others saw her as morally culpable, arguing that her wealth and privilege should have given her the courage to expose Harrison regardless of the consequences to her family. Several of the families Harrison had defrauded spoke out, with reactions ranging from gratitude for the anonymous restitution they had received to anger that Eleanor had not done more to hold Harrison accountable when he was alive. The Delgados issued a statement thanking Eleanor for the compensation, but noting that no amount of money could truly restore what their family had lost. Legal authorities in Connecticut and New York announced they would review the evidence Margaret had compiled, though they acknowledged that the statute of limitations on Harrison's crimes had long since expired. Several of Harrison's former associates were questioned, and two faced investigations into their own subsequent business practices, though no criminal charges were filed related to the historical fraud. For Eleanor, the aftermath of the article was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. The secret she had guarded for 3 decades was now public knowledge. Her privacy was invaded by journalists seeking follow-up interviews and photographers trying to capture images of the reclusive widow finally emerging from her mansion. She declined most requests for comment, but she did agree to a few carefully selected interviews where she could speak at length about the complexity of her choices. The most important change, however, was in her relationship with Victoria and James. The article forced them to confront their mother's humanity, to see her not as the cold and distant figure she had become, but as a woman who had made difficult choices and suffered for them. Victoria finally agreed to visit Eleanor in Greenwich, bringing her now adult children, who had never really known their grandmother. The visit was awkward and emotional, but it was a beginning. Victoria told Eleanor she was still processing everything, still angry and hurt, but she was willing to try to build a relationship. She said her children deserved to know their grandmother, and Eleanor deserved a chance to be more than the secret she had kept. James brought his partner to meet Eleanor, something he had never done in all the years of their distant relationship. He told Eleanor he was working on a book about ethical decision-making in families, inspired by her story. He said he didn't yet know if he thought she had made the right choices, but he understood why she had made them, and he wanted to help others think through similar dilemmas. In June 2016, 3 months after the article was published, Eleanor did something she hadn't done in 31 years. She hosted an event at the Vance Estate. It was small, just 20 people, including Victoria and her family, James and his partner, Margaret Chen and her parents, and several of the families who had received restitution from Eleanor's fund. Eleanor didn't give a speech. She simply welcomed everyone, thanked them for coming, and said she hoped this gathering could mark the beginning of something new. A community built on truth rather than silence. David and Lily Chen, now in their 70s, spoke briefly about their gratitude and forgiveness. Victoria read a letter she had written to her mother, acknowledging the pain on both sides and expressing hope for healing. The event wasn't triumphant. There was too much history, too much pain, for it to be a simple celebration. But it was honest, and for Eleanor, that honesty was more valuable than anything she had experienced in 3 decades. In the months that followed, Eleanor slowly began to rejoin the world. She accepted a few invitations from old friends, attended a charity event for the first time in 30 years, and even joined a book club in Greenwich. She sold several pieces of art from the mansion and donated the proceeds to organizations that helped families facing housing fraud and predatory lending. She also established a new fund, this one public and in her own name, dedicated to supporting investigative journalism that exposed corporate fraud. The first recipient of a grant from the fund was Margaret Chen, who used the money to continue her work investigating real estate corruption. Eleanor Vance is now 72 years old. She lives in the same mansion where she spent 3 decades in self-imposed exile, but it no longer feels like a prison. Victoria visits several times a year with her children. James calls every week. Eleanor has reconnected with a few old friends and made some new ones. She volunteers with a legal aid organization that helps elderly homeowners understand their rights. The silence that defined her life for so long has been replaced by conversation, messy and complicated and real. She still carries the weight of her choices, the knowledge that she could have done things differently, that her silence had consequences she can never fully undo. But she also knows that she did what she believed was right with the information and strength she had at the time, and that judgment from others and from herself is something she can survive. The inheritance of silence was 3 decades of isolation, estrangement from her children, and a burden that nearly destroyed her. But the inheritance of truth, difficult as it has been, has given Eleanor something she thought she had lost forever. The possibility of connection, redemption, and a future not defined entirely by the past. Eleanor Vance's story forces us to confront difficult questions about loyalty, justice, and the consequences of our choices. She discovered terrible truths about someone she loved and faced an impossible decision: expose those truths and destroy her family, or stay silent and protect them while betraying the victims who deserved justice. What would you have done in Eleanor's position? Was her decision to stay silent and provide anonymous restitution a reasonable compromise, or was it a moral failure that allowed Harrison's crimes to go unpunished? Did she have an obligation to expose Harrison regardless of the impact on her children? And after staying silent for 30 years, was her eventual decision to tell the truth an act of courage, or simply the final collapse of a weight she could no longer carry alone? Eleanor Vance spent 30 years building a fortress of silence to protect her family, only to realize that the walls she built were also keeping her from the people she loved most. While her husband Harrison left behind a fortune built on deception, Eleanor leaves us with a far more complex inheritance: the reminder that while we cannot rewrite our past, we are never truly powerless to define our redemption. The silence nearly destroyed her, but in the end, it was the truth that gave her a life worth living. Now, the final judgment belongs to you. If you were in Eleanor's position, would you have chosen the same path of quiet restitution? Or would you have exposed the truth back in 1985, regardless of the cost to your children? Was her silence a noble sacrifice or a moral compromise? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every perspective, and your insights are what make these chronicles complete. If this story moved you, please subscribe to Uncovered Family Files and click the notification bell to join us as we uncover more secrets that time tried to bury. And for another deep dive into the mysteries of hidden legacies, click now to watch our recommended video, The Widow's Secret Ledger: The Wealth Behind the Lies. Thank you for watching, and remember, every family has a secret, and every secret eventually finds its voice.